The boundary between life and death is supposed to be absolute. It is a line crossed once, an invisible threshold from which no traveler returns. We are taught that the end is final, a quiet shutting down of the human machine. But history hides moments when that line blurred. On a freezing morning in London, over 2 centuries ago, an audience of esteemed doctors watched a dead man breathe. They watched his eyes open. They watched his fist clench, his arm rise, and his face contort in a grimace of profound agony. And for a fleeting, terrifying moment, they believed they were witnessing the impossible. The historical records call it a mere scientific demonstration, a parlor trick of the new electrical age, meant to showcase the strange properties of primitive batteries. But when you look closer at the archives, when you trace the sudden, unexplained deaths that followed, and the frantic attempts by the medical establishment to bury the research, a very different story emerges. What really happened behind the locked doors of the Royal College of Surgeons? The year was 1803. The date, January the 18th. London was a city choked by coal smoke and gripped by a bitter winter frost. In the shadow of the infamous Newgate prison, a crowd had gathered to watch a man named George Forster swing from the gallows. Forster was not a good man. He had been convicted of a terrible crime, the murder of his wife and young child, whose bodies had been pulled from the freezing waters of the Paddington Canal. The law demanded his life, and the king's justice was swift. Forster was dropped from the scaffold, his body left to hang in the freezing air for a full hour to ensure the sentence was carried out. But Forster's journey was not over. By the mandates of the Murder Act of 1752, the bodies of executed killers were denied a peaceful burial. They were given over to the surgeons for dissection, a final indignity meant to terrify the public into obedience. Waiting for Forster's body was a man who had traveled a very long way for this exact moment, Giovanni Aldini. He was an eccentric Italian physicist, the nephew of the famous Luigi Galvani, and he carried with him a strange and powerful new invention, a massive Voltaic pile, one of the world's first electrical batteries. Aldini had a theory. He believed that the vital force of life itself was electrical, and he was about to use George Forster to prove it. The official narrative of what happened next is neatly summarized in the medical journals of the era. It is presented as a cold, clinical success. According to the accepted history, Forster's lifeless body was rushed to a nearby anatomy theater. Aldini, surrounded by the most prominent anatomists in England, connected a pair of copper wires to his crude battery. He then touched the conductive rods to various parts of the corpse. When he applied the current to the dead man's face, the jaw began to quiver. The muscles of the cheeks writhed. And then the left eye slowly opened, staring blankly into the sterile room. The demonstration continued. Aldini moved the rods to the ear and the rectum, sending a massive jolt of electricity through the entire nervous system. The official accounts state that the corpse began to convulse violently. The chest heaved as if drawing breath. The right arm rose into the air, the hand clenching into a tight fist. The legs kicked out, striking the wooden table. For all intents and purposes, the body appeared to be returning to life. But the mainstream historical consensus dismisses this. Science tells us today that this was simply the phenomenon of galvanism. Electricity causes muscle fibers to contract. It was a mechanical reaction, devoid of consciousness, devoid of a soul. The official story claims that Aldini proved his point, published his findings, and the scientific community nodded in agreement before moving on to other matters. It was a neat, tidy chapter in the grand march of human progress. But history is rarely neat, and when you strip away the polished veneer of the official reports, the foundation begins to crack. The first discrepancy lies in the reaction of the men in that room. These were not superstitious peasants easily frightened by a parlor trick. These were the elite surgeons of London, men who spent their days elbow-deep in cadavers, men who saw death in all its gruesome forms on a daily basis. Yet the contemporary accounts describe a room gripped by absolute, primal terror. Several prominent doctors reportedly fled the theater in panic. And then there is the curious case of Mr. Pass. Mr. Pass was the beadle of the surgeon's company, a man highly accustomed to the macabre environment of the dissection room. He was present during Aldini's experiment, standing near the table. The records show that shortly after witnessing the reanimation of George Forster, Mr. Pass suffered a sudden, massive shock. He collapsed and died shortly thereafter. The official explanation was that he died of fright. A weak heart overwhelmed by a disturbing sight. But hardened men do not die of fright from a simple, predictable muscle spasm. What did Mr. Pass actually see in Forster's open eye? What sound did he hear over the crackle of the battery that stopped his heart in his chest? To understand what might have gone wrong, we must dig deeper into the methods of the executioner and the grim realities of the era. Consider the mechanics of the gallows in 1803. The long drop, which instantly broke the neck and severed the spinal cord, had not yet been perfected. Hangings in this era were often agonizingly slow cases of strangulation. It was a well-known secret among the criminal underworld that if a man was cut down quickly enough, he could sometimes be revived. Now, consider the weather on January 18th. It was freezing. Forster's body was subjected to intense cold immediately upon losing consciousness. Modern medicine knows that extreme cold can drastically slow down the body's metabolism, preserving the brain and organs in a state of deep, suspended animation. This brings us to a terrifying question. When George Forster was laid on the slab at the Royal College of Surgeons, was he truly biologically dead? Or was he merely in a profound state of unconsciousness, his heart beating so faintly it could not be detected by the crude instruments of the early 19th century? Look at Aldini's own private writings from the years leading up to the London experiment. He had toured Europe, performing galvanic displays on the severed heads of oxen and the limbs of pigs. But his stated ambitions went far beyond making dead meat twitch. He actively spoke of resuscitation. He believed he was on the verge of discovering the cure for death by drowning, asphyxiation, and perhaps death itself. He demanded Forster's body be delivered to him entirely whole, without the standard preliminary incisions made by the executioner's surgeons. He needed the circulatory and nervous systems perfectly intact. He did not want a corpse to dissect. He wanted a patient to treat. If Forster was not entirely gone, the electricity pumped into his body might not have been animating a hollow vessel. It might have been restarting a stopped heart. Is it possible that Giovanni Aldini succeeded? That for a few agonizing minutes, the electrical current forced Forster's dormant brain back into waking consciousness? The sheer horror of that moment. To wake from the blackness of the gallows, paralyzed, unable to scream, feeling the agonizing burn of raw electrical current tearing through your nerves. To open one eye and see a ring of men in heavy wool coats staring down at you like a specimen on a pin. If this happened, it would explain the sheer panic in the room. It would explain the sudden death of Mr. Pass, who may have realized he was watching a man being tortured back from the grave, and it perfectly aligns with the strange, sudden suppression of galvanism that immediately followed. In the years after 1803, the British establishment quietly moved against these public reanimation experiments. Legislation was tightened regarding the treatment of executed prisoners. The medical journals, which had previously covered Aldini with fascination, suddenly began to mock his theories, aggressively pushing the concept of reanimation out of respectable science and into the realm of fiction. Why the sudden shift? Why abandon a promising field of medical research? Perhaps the answer lies not in science, but in the law. If a man condemned to die by the crown is executed, and then a doctor brings him back to life, what happens next? Has he served his sentence? Is he a free man? If science could override the king's justice, the entire foundation of the penal system would collapse. The state could not afford to let the dead walk away from the gallows. We find the most disturbing evidence of a cover-up hidden in the margins of history, in the fragmented letters and diaries of the junior surgeons present that day. One such observer was Anthony Carlisle, a rising anatomist who would later become the president of the Royal College of Surgeons. In the accepted historical texts, Carlisle is merely listed as an assistant to the procedure. But archival whispers, mentions in private correspondence among London physicians months later, suggest Carlisle saw things that were deliberately kept out of the official report. According to these fragmented accounts, Carlisle noted the temperature of Forster's skin. The room was freezing. The body had been dead for over an hour, yet as the current flowed, the flesh grew undeniably warm. More disturbingly, he noted a fine sheen of sweat forming on Forster's brow. Dead men do not sweat. Sweat requires active, functioning circulation and a responsive autonomic nervous system. Then there is the account of the final surge of electricity. The official report states that Aldini applied the maximum voltage he could muster, causing the body to move violently, before the experiment was simply concluded. But the suppressed letters speak of a sound. When the final jolt was applied directly to the base of the skull, the violent thrashing suddenly stopped. The chest expanded far beyond a mere muscle spasm, and a distinct, rattling breath was drawn into lungs that should have been forever empty. They say the room went entirely silent. Forster's remaining closed eye fluttered. The experiment did not end because Aldini had proven his point. The experiment ended because the authorities in the room violently intervened. They saw the implication. They saw the life returning to a man the state had declared dead. The records do not say who gave the order, but the command was absolute. They ordered the battery disconnected. And then, before any further observation could be made, they ordered the chief anatomist to step forward. Taking a heavy surgical blade, the anatomist quickly and deeply severed George Forster's spinal cord directly below the brainstem. They called it a standard part of the dissection process, a necessary step for anatomical study. But perhaps it was something else. Perhaps it was an execution. The second murder of George Forster, carried out in a sterile room to silence a secret the world was not ready for. Aldini was quietly ushered out of England shortly after. His grand visions of curing death were steadily dismantled by his peers. He died years later in obscurity, his name remembered only as a footnote, a minor inspiration for a teenage girl named Mary Shelley, who would write a novel about a doctor who built a monster from the dead. We are left to wonder what truly happened on that wooden table. The official narrative is safe. It is comfortable. It assures us that the line between life and death remains unbroken, that science is a rational progression devoid of dark, hidden corners. But history is written by the living, and the men who wrote the history of 1803 had every reason to hide the truth. Maybe the official story is right. Maybe the sweat on Forster's brow was just condensation from the cold air. Maybe the breath they heard was just trapped gas escaping a collapsing lung. Maybe Mr. Pass merely had a weak heart, doomed to fail on that specific morning. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was simply a series of accidents, exaggerated by terrified minds. Or maybe the people who lived through it saw something we no longer recognize.